お待たせいたしました。続いてのプログラムは、アレキサンドラ・デイジー・ギンズバーグさんのアーティストトークになります。デイジーさんの作品は、こちら表座敷のお隣、中の間にて、鑑賞いただけます。まずはじめに、デイジーさんの、ご紹介を私の方からさせていただきます。アレキサンドラ・デイジー・ギンズバーグは、自然やテクノロジーと私たちの危うい関係を考察する学際的なアーティストです。人工知能、合成生物学、自然保護、進化など多様なテーマを通じて世界をより良くしようとする人間の衝動を探求されています。彼女の作品はシカゴ美術館、クーバー・ヒューイット国立デザイン美術館、カールスルーエアート&メディアセンターなどに収蔵されています。2022年、花粉媒介者のための生きたアート作品シリーズ、ポリネーターパスメーカーを立ち上げ、世界最大のクライメートポジティブなアート作品を作りたいという長期的な願いのもと、実際に人間によって植物を植え、手入れをしています。それでは、デイジーさんのトークをお楽しみください。
Today, I'm going to talk about my artwork, Pollinator Pathmaker, and share with you some of the ideas behind the project. As an artist, my work looks at our relationship with the natural world and our hopefulness in the future. I'm also curious why we make technologies and have spent so much time separating us from the natural world through these technologies. A big question when we think of this idea of making a better world, a better future, which seems to be a sort of common statement in technology circles and politics, is that we're going to make things better, is actually to drill down and ask, well, what is better? Whose better is being delivered? And who gets to decide? And that's a really crucial way of thinking about the autonomy we have about social justice and about how futures are delivered unevenly for different people, but also for different species. One way to think about this idea of making a better world is how do we measure when things are getting better? What we have to think about, though, is this idea that what we measure is also what we value. For example, the biggest measure of the world getting better that we've had since the mid 20th century is gross domestic product, or GDP. But that is a measure of economic bettering, not of general well-being and environmental bettering, for example. So imagine the scenario of someone is driving their SUV, eating a hamburger, smoking a cigarette, and they crash into a pedestrian. The pedestrian is injured, and there's a court case and a big insurance claim. Everything in this scenario is good for GDP. It says that the world is getting better. But obviously nothing in that scenario is good for the environment. I argue, and I think we're beginning to accept this more generally, is that there is no future for us as humans without a functioning and protected natural environment. Without the world, without the nature that supports us and that we're part of, there is no better future for us. The world, nature itself will continue, but the comfortable environment that we're used to will be gone. A lot of my work to date has really focused on trying to explore and communicate and share stories about the loss of biodiversity, about extinction, from reconstructing a northern white rhino to sharing the smells of extinct flowers, for example. But for Pollinator Pathmaker, I wanted to do something different. That was to think about our agency. How, in the state of environmental emergency and climate crisis, as powerless individuals, how do we feel that we can do something? Not so much solve the problem, but feel empowered to reconnect to the natural world and to feel like there are things that we can do that can actually empower us in that process and enable us to do more and more. The Pollinator Pathmaker is an artwork specifically about insects. Now, if you imagine driving along the highway, maybe in your childhood, you'll remember that the windscreen would be covered in bugs, and you'd have, if it had been a long journey, you'd be washing the windscreen as you drive along. But now, if you think about it, after a long journey, there may be very few bugs, but perhaps you haven't noticed this change because it's happened over many years. And that's an example of something called shifting baseline syndrome, where something happens over a number of years so we don't notice it happening. And of course, our idea of a long time is very, very short in evolutionary and biological time. But it's enough that from season to season, year to year, decade to decade, we don't notice that slow shift and disappearance. Insects are in crisis, flying insects. This statistic of 75% decline in volume of insects in 30 years is from Germany, and similar reports are coming from elsewhere in the world. Without these insects, without specifically the pollinating insects, we have no functioning ecosystems. Some plants can reproduce without pollinators to help them. They use the wind, for example, or can self-pollinate. But many, many plants, including lots of the things that we eat, require insects or other mammals or birds, depending on the plant, to help them reproduce. So if those insects disappear, then the plants can't survive. I was asked to make an artwork to talk about this crisis, to share this crisis about pollinators by the Eden Project, which is an ecological attraction in Cornwall in southwest England. I thought that was a bit crazy because we were going to have a site outside in the Botanic Gardens to install this artwork, a sculpture, for example, or a pavilion to tell the story. But I thought it would be more useful to actually make something for the pollinators, to use this bit of ground outdoors, to use the budget to actually make a sculpture for the insects. And as I began to develop the idea, the next question was, what is an artwork for insects? What would it look like? And I began to explore the scientific research into how insects see. Now, on the left is a geranium flower, this red flower as humans see it. And on the right is a simulated version captured by a scientist photographer called Dr. Jolyon Troscianko of Exeter University. And in this image, he's trying to simulate what a bee might see in terms of color. So on the blue flower, you can see this green marking, and that's because the bee can see ultraviolet. But they don't see red because they don't have red sensors in their eyes. Although you'll notice that the leaves appear red to us, they don't appear red to the bee. So this for me was really a powerful story. On the left is a field of bluebells in an English woodland, and on the right, a simulation of what the bee might see in terms of color. What does it mean to look at a landscape if you're a bee? We think of the world being the world. The way we see it is the way the world is. But of course, it's not. It's just what we can see through the senses in our eyes that have evolved with us, the cones, the red, green, and blue cones in our eyeballs. So does the bee see the woodland like this? Well, actually, it's more complicated because they also can't see depth in the same way. So this research shows that from 2 centimeters already the flower is becoming blurred. So what does it mean to look at a landscape? The colors are different from as they're flying past. It's blurry, but also insects can see, they have a higher flicker threshold. So as they fly past, they see the flowers individually, whereas we would see a blur. So everything is different with different eyes. And that really, for me, was the way into this project. I'm still focusing on bees, although, of course, they are an important pollinator, but not the only one. Bees can memorize the locations of all the flower patches that they visit in a day, and they may visit 10,000 flowers in a day. So knowing the locations of those flower patches, but also being able to find the quickest route between them all is incredibly important. So here you see some of this route optimization. And it turns out that in maths, this is actually a really complex problem to solve. It's called the traveling salesman problem, finding the optimal fastest route between a number of points. So they are navigating the landscape in completely different ways to us, seeing it in different ways and memorizing it in different ways. That led me to this question. So if pollinators design gardens, what would humans see? Of course, when we create gardens, we're creating them from our perspective. We see the bluebell wood through our eyes. We see the garden through our eyes. But if pollinators were in charge, would they be planting differently? Would they be arranging the plants differently? And how would the experience of the layout be from our perspective? So that's the sort of setup for Pollinator Pathmaker, the kinds of ideas that were in my head as I began to answer this question. What is art for pollinators' tastes rather than human taste? Rather than our aesthetics, do insects have an aesthetic sense? Also rooted within this is this idea of altruism. So I began by talking about this idea of the better world, of trying to make things better, but that's always from the human perspective. Can we actually make things better, but for other species? Can we make technologies, for example, that aren't about us, aren't about improving the human condition, but really primarily about helping others? And I would argue it's not possible, but Pollinator Pathmaker is an attempt, and it's really a provocation to ask this question about altruism. So the root of the core of the project is an algorithm. And I wanted that algorithm to treat pollinators with empathy. What does that mean? How can we make an algorithm that is based in emotion, about feeling for others? I didn't know the answer, but I went to my string theory physicist collaborator, Dr. Shemek Vitichik, who I've worked with before. And I said, Shemek, I want to make this algorithm that can be empathetic to insects. Can you help me? And he said, well, that's great, but you need to tell me what empathy means for you in this case, because as an algorithm, we need to have a top problem to solve. Daisy, you need to define empathy in a way that can be encoded. So I had to choose a meaning for it. And in this case, I chose something that is very rational, which is different to emotion, but it is about supporting the maximum number of pollinator species possible. I chose for empathy to be about diversity and including as many species as we can. So the algorithm itself, which I'll talk a little bit more about it, but it works with a database of plants. And there are these two things in Pollinator Pathmaker working together. The database itself at the moment is suitable for the UK and much of Northern Europe. And we've also now expanded it with the second phase, which is including Germany and bits of Europe, which are hotter in the summer and colder in the winter. Of course, the goal is to do this all over the world, including Japan, but this is where I've started so far. So within this database is a carefully curated list of plants. I call it a plant palette. We're talking in the language of art here, rather than in the typical language of gardening. And in this palette, we have a number of different plants and different kinds of flowering plants. They're all within the world of perennials, so plants that grow for 3 to 5 years and are common in gardens, but also in wildflower meadows. You'll notice that on this image, there are 4 different plants, and there's a list of the pollinators for each plant underneath. And we don't need to know the names of these individual pollinators, but you can see on the left, the aster, the purple flower, has a much larger number of insects that like to visit it. Honeybees, bumblebees, moths, butterflies, whereas the Jerusalem sage on the right only is visited by bumblebees. And this is because different plants have co-evolved with their pollinators in a symbiotic relationship. The plants need the pollinators so they can have sex, and the pollinators need the plants so that they can feed on the nectar and the pollen. Some plants, like the aster on the left, have very open heads, so it's very easy for lots of different kinds of insects to access the pollen. Whereas on the right, the sage has these complicated flowers, which you need a specific set of mouth parts or a specific shape of body or tongue to get inside. So some plants are generalists and some are specialists. Within the database, we're including both kinds. And the idea is that the algorithm will select from the database and make a curation of a number of plants from it. And some will be generalists and some will be specialists. Some will bloom in the spring, some will bloom in the summer, and some in the autumn. Some will be tall, some will be short, some will suit some will be one set of colors because insects are attracted to that, whereas others will be completely different colors because different insects can see it. What the algorithm is doing is creating a plant list that's unique for each garden that is created. And within that plant list, there's a balancing of plants to spread blooming across the year, so from as early as possible to as late as possible in the seasons, and to ensure the maximum diversity of pollinators is served. So you can play with the algorithm at pollinator.art, which is the project website. And I apologize that it's not yet in Japanese, but I hope that we will get there. And you'll also see that the plant lists at the moment are Europe-centric. So I'll play a little video now as I talk to explain what it looks like when you visit the website. So it starts with the tool to actually design your garden patch, and you can cut out pixels so you could make a path or a space for a bench. Then you can choose the soil conditions for this piece of land. It doesn't need to exist in real life, but if you do have a garden or a place that you can plant, you can put in those conditions. Then you get to the fun bit, which is to play with the algorithm. And you'll see here that there's ways to sort of choose and fine-tune it, more plant species, bolder pattern, or more paths or more patches. But whatever you choose, it will create a unique solution that supports as many different species as possible. So this is an example, randomly created. You can press create new garden over and over again and get a different result every time. In this garden, we can fly through it, we can see it, and I painted all of these flowers in different seasons so that we can see a garden existing not just in space, but also in time. As it cycles through the year, we see flowers blooming, and this is the pixelated version of it. It really shows this pattern, things coming into bloom and disappearing. The site also allows you to explore what the different plants are, so you can begin to understand what's there. And then what I've done now is switched on the pollinator filter, which is a way of telling the story of how insects see the garden in different light. Now, it's extremely complicated because different insects see in different ways, so it's really a storytelling device. But what the key thing here is this ability to actually download the planting instructions for whatever you've just created. And this is a very big one. This is 15 meters by 15 meters. But it gives you a plant list so you can go shopping and buy these plants or buy seeds and start to grow it up from seed. And there's an invitation essentially to fabricate your edition of the artwork. And that's the goal behind Pollinator Pathmaker, is something completely crazy, which is to create the world's largest climate positive artwork, and to do that together. Now, I don't know what a climate positive artwork is because there aren't very many of them around. And that's something that is also a provocation in this project, is to ask, well, how do we make art differently? What does it mean to grow an artwork, to create a living artwork that over the years that it is installed actually provides a benefit to the world? It tells a story, but it also connects us with nature. We sit and we make something together, and the more we create, the more abundance and flourishing there is. So this is just a little tour of some of the living artworks that I have created so far. The first was at the Eden Project in Cornwall, And here's me gardening. In fact, I'm wearing my gardening shirt now. And we planted this garden, which is 52 meters long with about 7,000 plants a couple of years ago in 2021. This was it last summer, really coming into bloom. But it's quite a strange garden, and that's the intention here. Things are pushed together that we wouldn't normally see next to each other. It has all the different colors to attract all the different insects. And it's perhaps not what a human would design. And the stranger it looks, I think, the better it is, because it tells us that this is something different. It's not designed for humans, it's designed for other species. Now, the next garden we planted, or next living artwork, was for the Serpentine in London. It's in Hyde Park, and it's an area just near Lancaster Gate Tube, if you happen to come to London to visit. And this one is much more of a meadow. It's 11 beds that are scattered over 250 meters across all these different beds. And this is a little visualization of what that looks like, switching between human view and pollinator view. And it's really exciting once you plant one of these to then see, does it match the digital world that I created for it? And this is a photo from this summer of that garden. So you may recognize some of the flowers. In fact, some of the flowers that are behind me now, these yellow Anthemis tinctoria. The most recent one we've planted was in Berlin and in front of the Natural History Museum there. So this garden is also about 700 square meters and has about 7,000 plants. And it's so exciting, this location, because it is in front of a natural history museum. And that means that the Natural History Museum behind this living artwork is filled with dead things, collections of insects and all sorts of different organisms that are also being studied scientifically. So the building is full of scientists who come outside now and see this living artwork and are studying it as well, which insects are visiting, and it becomes another exhibit for the museum, but one that is full of life. So about 1 million visitors walk through this garden every year now. And this, because it was just planted in May, is still coming to life, but this was it already in July this year as the first flowers came into bloom. And I mentioned the scientists studying it. So there's a brilliant site called iNaturalist, which is a citizen science, but also a research science website where people can upload observations and the scientists can verify the observations. So we're starting to study what insects are actually on the site. So you can take a look at that at iNaturalist if you look for Pollinator Pathmaker Berlin. So those are the big commissioned editions, and they work in a way that is a bit like a mycelial network. So we have these big hubs of the big public gardens, and then the idea is that at each location, the commissioner then helps us start a DIY campaign, and that means people can go to the website and create their own edition to plant at home. And this is so important because we're creating a network of living artworks across a landscape. One garden is not much use. What actually matters is connecting a landscape as insects fly across it. They don't see a garden as a garden. A garden is really a node on a network for them. So the DIY editions are starting to come to life. And this is a much trickier thing to do because you need a big press campaign to get people to know about it and to get excited. And of course, there's also a problem built into this project, and that is not all of us have gardens. In fact, most people don't. It's a privilege to have your own outdoor space to plant in. But you can, even if you have a balcony, you can join in, and we give instructions on the website how to scale down the planting. But most importantly, it's actually an invitation to activism, to a form of creative activism. Can you get a group of kids together at a school and persuade the school to give up some green space like this one did, Roach School in Cornwall, to give children a chance to plant an artwork and learn to look after it and care for it? Can you get a group from your community together and find a piece of ground that's unloved and persuade the council or different authorities to let you do this? It's an invitation to transformation of yourself and of your local environment. So these are some of the additions that have just been planted in Berlin. This one's in a community space. The first one I showed you was at a school. This is a little strip of a bit of street in Berlin. This is another school with kids getting involved, and it's so exciting to see this starting to happen. This is my one at home, which you'll see is very unconventional. So on the left was what it was like before, in the middle, what it was like after 1 year, and on the right, it's gone crazy. It's 2.5 meters tall at one end, and then about 0.5 meter tall at the other. It's not a garden for me. It's something that I have to look after for its real audience, who are the pollinating insects and the plants. And these are some of the things that I saw visiting the artwork over the summer. So I'm really changing my focus. I'm not a gardener by training, by experience. I'm a beginner. And now I am learning by doing. And I'm looking at these plants not for their beauty, but enjoying looking at them for these moments, these little moments where the insects come to visit. And it's a totally different way of thinking about the garden. These interactions are actually the art. So I started with this question about how do we make a better world? And I think a better question is, how do we do better for all species, not just for ourselves? And Pollinator Pathmaker is a celebration and an exploration of these values of empathy and care. And really, I'm thinking about how do we, when it comes to art and also to the world around us, how do we transform ourselves from consumers into caretakers? And how do we do that together? So thank you so much. And I really hope that we can bring this work to Japan, and so we can all get planting in Japan. Thank you.
So the first question is, do you have a vision for the project in Japan and Asia? And if so, what is your vision?
I think we need to bring Pollinator Pathmaker to Matsudo, to Japan, and to Asia, in a broader context. The idea is to make the world's largest climate positive artwork. It's not a Eurocentric artwork. It really needs as many people as possible to get involved. And I have a particular love of Japanese gardens. My father, by coincidence or by destiny, is an expert in Japanese and East Asian gardens. But those gardens are normally Zen gardens, and they don't have many flowers in them. And this is great fun for me and my father as we discuss gardening and control. And so challenging the what a garden is in Japan in terms of classical ideas, but also getting more people involved to think about it in a different way, to think about wildness and chaos in the urban environment and beyond would be such fun. So let's bring it to Japan. Let's make some gardens full of insects and get as many people involved in playing with plants and learning how they grow and taking care of them is my dream. It would be wonderful.
Thank you. And then the next question is, so this year's theme is Seeds of Hope. And I think your project is definitely one of the top representing projects under this theme. We just wanted to ask if you have a message to the viewers on this topic of Seeds of Hope.
I think it's very difficult to talk about hope in the current state we're in. I'm in London today. It's October. It's 20-something degrees. Something is not right. And yet what we must do is have hope. We have to, despite our panic at the climate emergency, despite our fear, that we cannot do anything about it, that the problem is too big, that governments and politicians and the economy, it means that we can't address it in time. I still think as animals, we are hopeful animals, and hope is powerful, especially in darkness. To fight against that darkness, we have to do things, we have to imagine, but hope is not enough. It's actually about doing something. And Pollinator Pathmaker, along with many other amazing works that you are featuring in this season, I think is a tool to act. And the metaphor of the seed, the idea of the seed, and in this case the seeds themselves, if you plant an artwork, contain hope, but it requires us to plant them, and that's what's so important. And we just all need to grow more plants.